Now it's time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And I realize that your Independence Day begins as soon as I stop speaking to you tonight. and so, unless you'd like to hold forth on any afterthoughts you have after doing an hour of TV, I'm prepared to just say good night.
Bye.
Bye, Rachel. Thank you very much. And she's off on her 4th of July. Well, as America approaches its annual day of celebrating our independence, it is worth emphasizing that this is not Donald Trump's America. The president does sometimes try to behave like a king. He tries to behave like he owns the place. But what we are celebrating tomorrow is independence from a king. And there is no figurative or poetic sense in which this is Donald Trump's America. The picture that new polling presents is largely a country that opposes President Trump. A new Quinnipiac poll tonight shows that 55% of Americans disapprove of the job Donald Trump is doing as president. And some of that disapproval is now coming from Republican senators, finally, which we will get to in a moment. But there's another unique entry in this new Trump poll. It is an achievement that belongs to Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone in the history of Quinnipiac polls, in the history of all presidential polls. Donald Trump has won the highest number of people in the history of presidential polling who say the President of the United States is a racist. In the new Quinnipiac poll, 49% of voters say the president is a racist. 47% say they don't think he is. In the history of presidential polling, no one is a close second to Donald Trump on the racist question. In fact, as far as we've been able to find in our research about polling today, there's no one in second place, because the question has never been asked in polling about any other president. The racism of Donald Trump, as perceived by half of the country, is not what is bothering Republican senators about Donald Trump. Some of them are making comments about the president unlike anything they have ever said. Consider the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch. And remember that Orrin Hatch is the senator who said this about Donald Trump.
We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to make this the greatest presidency that we've seen, not only in generations, but maybe ever.
So the only member of Congress, and possibly the only American not named Trump, who has said that Donald Trump could be the best president ever, is now saying something that doesn't sound like Orrin Hatch at all. I actually don't recognize the current Trump-supporting version of Orrin Hatch. The Orrin Hatch who I knew and saw virtually every day when I was working on the Senate Finance Committee in the 1990s was one of the reasonable and sometimes cooperative and compromising Republicans on the committee who helped get the committee's work done, especially on matters of international trade. And Orrin Hatch has always been the quintessential representative of mild-mannered Utah politeness in the United States Senate. So imagine my shock when I read Orrin Hatch saying, "I'd like to kill him," in Politico. Orrin Hatch would like to kill the Trump tariffs. According to Politico, Republican senators say they can't get the president to comprehend that his tariffs offensive could damage the American economy. And so there is a rebellion brewing among Republican senators on the Trump tariffs. And this could be the thing that pushes Donald Trump's disapproval rating even higher. According to the Des Moines Register, Iowa soybean farmers could lose up to $624 million in export revenue because of retaliatory tariffs on soybeans. Iowa's junior senator, Republican Joni Ernst, told Politico, "We want to support the president. My constituents want to support the president as well. But they can only keep that stiff upper lip before things collapse. We're not quite at that point, but it's rapidly approaching." So the new definition of representing your state as a Republican in the United States Senate seems to be stick with Donald Trump until your state collapses. Joni Ernst apparently has no intention of abandoning the president before the collapse of Iowa. She seems to be saying she will have to see the complete collapse of the farm economy in Iowa for her to abandon the president. Donald Trump came in second in the Iowa caucuses at the beginning of the presidential campaign. If he keeps up his trade war with the world, Donald Trump just might find a way to come in second in the Iowa caucuses again in 2020. Leading off our discussion now, Jared Bernstein, Senior Fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. He was a Chief Economist and Economic Policy Advisor to Vice President Biden. Also with us, Neera Tanden, President of the Center for American Progress. She was Hillary Clinton's Policy Director during the 2008 presidential campaign. And John Harwood is with us. He's the Editor-at-Large for CNBC. And John Harwood, I wanted to start with you because the Commerce Secretary said on CNBC that there is no drop in the stock market dramatic enough. There's no way any of the changes in the stock market that we're seeing could possibly affect the president's commitment to his tariffs. But we must stipulate that he is only the Secretary of Commerce, which means he, like the rest of us, has no idea what Donald Trump's going to do tomorrow on tariffs.
Well, and Donald Trump may have no idea what Donald Trump's going to do tomorrow on tariffs. This is somebody who does not have a firm grasp of policy issues, of the implications of his policies. He acts on gut instinct and impulse, and he has had anti-free trade impulses for quite a long time. But this is deeply irrational from the standpoint of somebody who's leading a country, who wants to have a strong economy, who wants to protect his constituents, who wants to get reelected, because of the damage in the Midwest. If he goes ahead with the national security-linked auto tariffs he's talking about, the agricultural Midwest, Iowa and other places, if he sticks with this tariff war, it makes no sense economically, and it's also counterproductive politically. Nevertheless, the president's doing it, and it makes you wonder, is he actually acting rationally while doing this? We don't know.
And Neera Tanden, the president's statements on trade were not very specific during the campaign. It was all about just ripping up NAFTA and getting rid of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, just getting rid of these agreements that are kind of large and complex agreements. But he never really said what he would do in its place. He never went around the country campaigning saying, I am going to impose through tariffs what are, in effect, massive sales taxes on American consumers who buy anything made outside of the United States.
And he also didn't say, I'm going to threaten the jobs of lots of farmers and lots of manufacturers. The reality of what we're dealing with Donald Trump is, for some reason that's really hard to fathom, he's decided to go to and have a trade war with our closest allies, Canada, Europe. He's essentially, and at the same time, hurting Americans. And I have to just state this, his health care bill went after rural white voters in places like Iowa and the Midwest, throughout the South. Now his trade policies are targeting farmers. Lots of manufacturers throughout the country, nail producers, are going out of business. It's as if he's taking a wrecking ball to the lives and fortunes of the people who actually just voted for him, and really testing essentially how much of a lemming they're going to be in support of him as much as he hurts them.
Jared Bernstein, it seems the president has discovered that he has a power that he can use without consulting anyone. He discovered that in the pardon power to his delight, which seems to be what he likes most about pardons, as well as possibly signaling future criminal defendants who are friends of his that they might be getting pardons. But he found the loophole, his staff found the loophole in American trade law in Section 232 that allows the president to impose tariffs only as a matter of national security, and none of the tariffs that the president has imposed or announced his intention to impose actually involve national security. And so at a certain point, the Republicans in the Senate who have always objected to this kind of thing are finally beginning to find their voices, but their voices at this point seem to be whispering.
Yeah, I agree with you. Canada is not a security threat. Neither is the European Union. And in fact, if anything, the president seems to embrace leaders who are threats and go after ones who aren't. Look, the Senate has long folded, conservatives and Republicans, in the face of Trumpian chaos, even when it comes to matters of the well-being of their own constituents. You know, we used to say in Washington, follow the money. Well, follow the soybeans right now, because a lot of farmers' income is at stake. And, you know, Donald Trump said he doesn't like all those German cars on the street. That's what motivated his potential auto tariffs. Well, do you know where the biggest BMW factory is in the world? It's in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And by the way, American auto producers, Ford, Chrysler, GM, uniformly oppose auto tariffs. Why? You think it would help their competitiveness? Because every single car on the road now, including the ones that American producers build, has lots of foreign imports. And if their price of every one of them goes up 20%, that's going to be a cost they're going to have to pass on to consumers. It's chaotic, destructive policy that is not going to help people who've been hurt by trade. People who really need help, by the way, it's going to hurt them.
And Lawrence?
And go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, it may be that President Trump in this situation cares more about trying to exert his personal dominance over another leader than he does about the fate of his own constituents and their economic well-being. He loves to engage on a personal basis. He makes decisions based on how he feels about someone personally, and we've seen with Justin Trudeau that he has tried to, in effect, say, I'm bigger than you. He's done the same thing with Angela Merkel, Theresa May. He may be trying to use this power that he possesses uniquely with a justification, even if it's bogus, to try to assert that he can dominate them.
See, the only thing
go ahead, Nir.
I would just quickly add, what's crazy about this situation is Donald Trump himself is basically hurting soybean manufacturers, soybean farmers, manufacturers throughout this country, lots of people, lots of Americans who are struggling to get by, while at the same time basically doing ads for China ZTE, which is just, you know, I've never heard or seen anything like it, where an American president is hurting American companies and workers and basically helping a Chinese company.
Yeah. The one thing I would add,
and Jared,
oh, sure, go ahead. So the one thing I would add is that we actually have a pretty good-looking macroeconomy right now. The unemployment rate is low. Growth rates are pretty stable. And the best thing I can say about the Trump contribution to the economy is he hasn't screwed it up yet, but he seems to be trying pretty hard to do so.
John, I was going to point out, I'm glad Nira brought up ZTE, because ZTE is the only issue that anyone in Washington has looked at and said there are some national security concerns with that. Most of China trade involves absolutely no security concerns whatsoever. And so the Trump tariffs are illegal by our own definition because they do not meet the national security standard. They do violate the World Trade Organization's own definitions of correct use of tariffs. But there has been astonishing support for this seizure, this presidential seizure of congressional power, astonishing support from Democrats. Chuck Schumer actually said in regards to the China tariffs, President Trump is right on target. That was Chuck Schumer's reaction to it. And last week, when some Republicans were trying to get an amendment going on the agriculture bill to restrict the president's power to increase tariffs through this loophole, Sherrod Brown, Democrat, stood up and opposed and blocked that amendment. That was an amendment to limit Donald Trump's illegal use of presidential power, and that illegal use of presidential power was supported on the Senate floor by Democrats.
Well, look, a lot of people want to get tough with China, and China is the legitimate bad actor in international trade that we have big grievances in. Their theft of intellectual property, the restrictions they place on American investment in China. And that's what makes the ZTE case that you mentioned so striking. It's a real national security case. He's gone the other way. And because of the other extraordinary feature of Trump's presidency, that is, he continues to make money as president with his businesses, although he's not managing them overseas. And so the Chinese government's lending $500 million to a Trump project in Indonesia. Dozens of trademarks have been granted to Donald Trump and Ivanka Trump business initiatives in China. Is that why he is supporting ZTE? It's difficult to figure that out. Nobody really knows the answer, but it's certainly something that goes diametrically against the national security interests of the United States when he is erroneously citing them in other areas.
I mean, at the end of the day, we have... Oh, go ahead.
I just want to get your political reaction to Democrats on the Senate floor like Sherrod Brown, also Chuck Schumer, supporting the president in what is clearly an illegal use of the national security loophole in trade law and supporting President Trump in a seizure of what is supposed to be Senate and congressional power.
Look, I think anyone who supports Donald Trump's illegal use of the rules, the things he's doing to basically affirm his agenda at the expense of real national security threats like ZTE itself, you know, Democrats should not do that. And I appreciate in a lot of parts of the country, trade is a hard issue. And John Harwood is absolutely right. Trade with China is a much more legitimate issue than a phony trade war with Canada or Europe. And when the president has a phony trade war and has phony national security reasons for a trade war with our closest allies, Democrats should stand up to that. But I think what's also really important is, you know, we have to ensure that we at some point get some investigatory power, because at this point we have a president who has a trade policy that hurts Americans and helps his own pocketbook. And that we have at least reasons to ask questions about that. And because the Republicans won't do any investigations, Americans don't really know at the end of the day whether the ZTE deal or other things Trump is doing is actually helping himself at the expense of voters.
Jared Bernstein, the American government has done very well in the World Trade Organization when it comes to trade disputes. It wins almost all of them. And it's always prosecuting these trade disputes against countries that are violating the rules. Now the United States of America is violating the rules in a grander, more open way than we have ever seen any other country do. There have been, when other countries try to violate the rules, they try to do it secretly. Here is the President of the United States doing it publicly. What does that do to America's position in the World Trade Organization going forward?
Well, I think it makes it obviously extremely difficult for us to argue for a rules-based system of international trading. And it's that very system that Trump's chaos is throwing a wrench into. And by the way, as I've tried to stress in earlier comments, there are definitely Americans who have been hurt by the fact that we've run large trade deficits for many years. And Donald Trump connected with those people during the campaign. They voted for him. Now he's hurting them. When it comes to the WTO, however, you know, looking tough, disobeying, dismissing the WTO for Donald Trump is a feature, not a bug. He views the WTO as an anarchic organization that has no more relevance in his kind of make it up as you go along trade regime. And so I think what the problem ends up being at the end of the day is that initially everybody thought he was just bloviating. I'm talking about our trading partners. Then they started to talk about retaliation. Now they're moving into a mode of really fighting back tough. And so I think the problem of retaliation to these measures is enough to really shave some significant growth off the U.S. economy if we keep going down the same path we're going on. We really haven't seen that yet. But if Donald Trump gets his way with a trade war of the magnitude that I fear he's seeking, we're all going to feel it in our pocketbooks.
That'll have to be the end of the first round. Jared Bernstein, Neera Tanden, and John Harwood, thank you for joining us at the beginning here tonight. Really appreciate it. And coming up, once again, we are learning news about the President of the United States from the Russian government before we learn it from the White House. And NBC News has what White House sources have said is the complete short list of candidates to be the next Trump Supreme Court nominee. A bipartisan report released today by the Senate Intelligence Committee confirms the findings of the U.S. intelligence community, which stated in January 2017 that Russia definitely meddled in the 2016 presidential election and that Russia definitely wanted to hurt the candidacy of Hillary Clinton and help the candidacy of Donald Trump. Specifically, the unclassified report released by Republican Richard Burr and Democrat Mark Warner of the Intelligence Committee says that the committee's assessment, quote, showed that Moscow sought to denigrate Secretary Clinton and Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for Trump. The report today also says that the committee heard consistently that analysts were under no politically motivated pressure to reach any conclusions. And the committee has seen additional examples of Russia's attempts to sow discord, undermine democratic institutions, and interfere in U.S. elections and those of our allies. The Kremlin said today that it is possible that Russian President Vladimir Putin and President Trump will meet one-on-one with no staff present except translators at the beginning of their summit meeting in Helsinki on July 16th. And so once again, Americans are learning about the plans of the President of the United States from the Russian government instead of from the White House. Joining our discussion now, Malcolm Nance, an MSNBC counterterrorism and intelligence analyst and author of the new book, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, How Putin and His Spies Are Undermining America and Dismantling the West. Also with us, Evelyn Farkas, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. She is an MSNBC national security analyst. And Malcolm, I want to start with you on the issue of the possibility of the president sitting down one-on-one plus translators with Vladimir Putin.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating. You know, earlier today on Twitter, Asha Rangappa, the former FBI officer, made a joke that he was going in to meet his handler, was going to discuss any concerns that he have, any counterintelligence contacts that he has, his surveillance detection routines, anything that a handled asset would want to report into his boss. And at this point, I'm really starting to wonder, because why would he go off the record in a private meeting with Vladimir Putin at a time he has been under the gun for more than 2 years in the belief that he has conspired with Russia to rig a U.S. election and may possibly have involved himself in other nefarious activities, and he just decides he's going to go prove it?
Evelyn Farkas, it is an astonishing thing to watch. I mean, with any other politician who is suspected of anything in this direction, that politician would go out of his or her way to be much stiffer and more formal and more distant in relations with Russia or whatever country was in question.
Right, Lawrence. I mean, any other president or politician for that matter, and granted, okay, he wasn't a politician until recently, but nevertheless would do everything possible to remove any shadow of any doubt that there was something nefarious going on. I have to say I'm also further concerned because what I'm hearing not only from the administration is actually confirmation that there is going to be a one-on-one meeting, but that there's a lot of consternation, a lot of worry inside our government. I mean, that to me is shocking. And people just feel like they can't resign because of their concern, but they're watching some kind of train wreck, some kind of really bad movie unfold, except that it's reality. So I don't understand why this is happening. Last time Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of a bigger summit, he actually had a meeting with only one interpreter, the Russian interpreter. So if that happens again, that's even worse. But, you know, okay, having interpreters is good if at least we have the U.S. interpreter, because there will be something of a record in that case. But the optics are bad. It doesn't make sense from a policy perspective. It's just more than unfortunate.
And this news comes to us on the same day that the Senate Intelligence Committee report, and this is the full committee, this is all 8 Republicans and all 7 Democrats. The committee says this: the committee concurs with intelligence and open source assessments that this influence campaign was approved by President Putin. And so the committee is saying Vladimir Putin did this, and now Donald Trump is saying that he's going to have a one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin. Within the context of all of that, let's listen to what former CIA Director John McLaughlin said about this today.
The president is an intelligence recruiter's dream. He's totally transparent with his tweets and his public comments. His frustrations, his desires, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities are all hanging out there. And Putin, of course, is a trained KGB intelligence operator.
Malcolm Nance, you know that any screenwriter or fiction writer would try to make this more subtle. They wouldn't actually have the Russian president be a former KGB intelligence operator talking to the most ignorant president of the United States in history.
Yeah, you would think that, right? But this is like a really bad version of the old movie, Kevin Costner movie, No Way Out, where we, you know, in that private meeting, is Donald Trump going to just suddenly blurt out that he speaks Russian? Doubtful. But for the most part, I really think that John McLaughlin today put it perfectly. And I have a whole chapter on why Donald Trump is a Russian's dream. It's not just that they may have motivated him to see the world their way. They framed the world for him. And every time that he had contact with them, they created that perception bubble, that entire worldview that he now espouses. Break up and dissolution of NATO in a slow roll, I think he really believes that. Getting rid of all world trade, that, you know, and breaking up the Atlantic Alliance in Europe, he has bought into that. Crimea belonging to Russia, he has bought into that. He is, you know, I said this today in the same interview with John McLaughlin. When he goes to this NATO conference, who will he represent? Will he represent the United States, or will he represent Moscow?
Or Donald Trump.
Maria Bartiromo did a recent interview with the president where she got a lot of criticism for not doing any follow-ups. She did ask some good questions. So here's an example of her good question and just an extraordinary non-answer by the president of the United States. Let's listen to this.
Are you going to mention the meddling when you meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin July 16th?
I'd like to see some answers as to why we didn't take the server, why the FBI didn't take the server from the DNC.
And Evelyn Farkas, that was his complete answer to, are you going to mention the Russian meddling in our election when you speak to Vladimir Putin? He said, I'd like to see some answers as to why we didn't take the server, why the FBI didn't take the server from the DNC.
I mean, Lawrence, this isn't the first time I think I've said to you I want to tear my hair out, because he's doing his typical deflection. You know, I'm going to talk about Hillary Clinton now. You know, nobody cares about Hillary Clinton anymore and servers and emails and whatever. But that's the first thing he grasps for. You know, I have to say just a thing about that report that came out today. I think it's very useful that the Senate Intelligence Committee came out clearly on the record saying we believe our own intelligence. We looked through it ourselves in a bipartisan fashion. What's disturbing to me about it is that it came out today on a Friday. Well, it feels like a Friday, but right before a holiday. And it should have come out before those senators made the decision to go over to Moscow, you know, which you mentioned earlier in the program. I think it's unfortunate because it seems to me that they could agree on the message, but there's something wrong with the politics of releasing this report.
I don't think the president could have made it any more clear to Maria Bartiromo that he has absolutely no intention of mentioning election meddling to Vladimir Putin. Evelyn Farkas, Malcolm Nance, thank you both for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
And when we come back, NBC News has what White House sources are telling them is the complete short list of candidates to be the next Trump Supreme Court nominee. Here is one of the frontrunners for the next Supreme Court nomination testifying at her last confirmation hearing for a federal judgeship.
I'm being considered for a position on a court of appeals, and there would be no opportunity to be a no vote on Roe. And as I said to the committee, I would faithfully apply all Supreme Court precedent.
But on the Supreme Court, she would be in a position to overturn Roe versus Wade. That was Judge Amy Coney Barrett, who yesterday met with President Trump to discuss the Supreme Court vacancy. The president also met with 3 other federal appeals court judges yesterday who are candidates for the next Supreme Court nomination: Brett Kavanaugh, Raymond Kethledge, and Amul Thapar. This afternoon, an assistant White House press secretary said, quote, "The president spoke to 3 potential Supreme Court nominees today." The assistant press secretary did not say who those people are, but NBC News is reporting that the president's list of possible nominees includes federal appeals court judges Joan Larson and Thomas Hardiman and Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee. Today, Senator Lee's spokesperson confirmed a report that the president interviewed Senator Lee yesterday over the phone about the Supreme Court opening, while the White House said the 2 men spoke by phone but did not call it an interview. Back with us for this part of the discussion, John Harwood and Neera Tanden. Neera, your reaction to what we know about the president's list so far?
Yeah, I mean, everyone on this list is pretty much a hard right jurist. Each one of them would threaten Roe v. Wade. Each one of them would likely overturn the Affordable Care Act. You know, there's a lot of gamesmanship happening amongst conservatives, essentially trying to figure out whether we can have a hard right Supreme Court justice or an insane right Supreme Court justice. And, you know, I think the American people, when they look at these justices and actually how they've ruled, or judges and how they've ruled, they'll recognize that these people are all far outside the mainstream of where the American people are and where the Senate should be.
I think we can probably agree that the phone call to Mike Lee was just being nice to Mike Lee. I don't think you're going to pick someone for the Supreme Court if you don't even invite him over the House. But Mike Lee is a member of the Judiciary Committee. He'd be part of the confirmation process. And so perhaps President Trump simply wanted to elevate Mike Lee's standing back home in Utah. But John Harwood, we have an NBC News poll showing that 61% want Roe versus Wade to be upheld. Only 31% want it to be overturned, and that would seem to indicate that that's where the Democrats should be putting the pressure as this confirmation process unfolds.
Right, and you know, all of these nominees, as Neera indicated, are people who ideologically are at odds with the majority of the American people. Now, that's why I think the stakes for the individual candidates are big. The stakes for different factions of the conservative movement. Mitch McConnell's got a candidate. Bill Bennett's got a candidate. They're various ones, and each faction will fly-spec the records of the others. But for the rest of the country, people outside that group, these choices are all pretty much the same. And they have been pre-selected for their fealty to conservative judicial positions, and one bedrock, conservative judicial positions is that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. Now, is it possible that one of these people will get on the court and later decide, given the public opposition, that 60% figure you cited, maybe we don't go that far, maybe we nick at it rather than frontally try to repeal it. But these people are all coming from one particular direction, and that is where Democrats will have their most ability to make hay, but I don't think they can stop it because I think Republicans are going to have the votes.
Neera Tanden, I'm looking at Joan Larson as the one who seems to make the most sense within the White House. They're trying to hold on to 2 Republican senators, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, the only 2 pro-choice Republicans in the Senate. It seems to me nominating a woman would help there. And Joan Larson, just last year, when she was confirmed to the appeals court, she got 60 votes. She got 8 Democrats to vote for her, 8 Democrats. And so she would seem to be the one who, just in terms of the past confirmation vote performance, is probably the strongest, safest one on this list in the Senate.
You know, I would say that this is a very different decision, a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court, on a court that cannot. There's no check on this court. Once it decides, it decides. And I think the truth is that Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski are hoping that these hearings are a kabuki theater in which people say just bland statements about supporting precedent and they won't rule, and they're able to skate by this nomination process. And ultimately, a hard right conservative goes on the court, and we could lose Roe in 2 years' time in 18 states in the country. And I think the only thing that's going to stop that kabuki theater and that game is for the American people to do what they did during health care and really hold people accountable. Susan Collins could be a United States Senator when the person she votes for, if she votes for a Trump nominee from this list, that she could be there when Roe is overturned. And I think the usual statements of, oh, do you support precedent, or some bland statements about not deciding cases should be unacceptable. Our rights are at stake. These judges, given the overwhelming support for Roe, they have to affirm their support for Roe as precedent in the law of the land today that they will not overturn. Or Susan Collins, if she votes for this person, or Lisa Murkowski, or they vote for these potential nominees, has to say they are no longer pro-choice.
Neera Tanden and John Harwood, thank you both for joining us once again tonight. Really appreciate it. And coming up, a federal judge another federal judge, this is the third federal judge who's entered this situation, has ordered the Trump administration to reunite parents and children at the border. This federal judge says that the Trump administration is violating its own rules at the border. Tonight, a family of 3 is being held in a Trump cage. A father, a mother, and a baby named Jesus. Here they are in their Trump cage. It is on the grounds of an Episcopal church in Indianapolis. The church's dean and rector, Reverend Stephen Carlson, was asked how long he would keep the family who Christians call the Holy Family in that cage. Reverend Carlson said, "How long are we going to keep detaining families indefinitely?" Reverend Carlson's interpretation of the Christian symbolism of the Holy Family is that every family is holy. They were a homeless family with nowhere to stay, Reverend Carlson said about Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. He said, "I think our faith tells us where we need to be. We're turning away from the values that should be guiding us. The point of a religious icon is to move our hearts. If at first people are upset by it, that might just be God trying to move their hearts. I hope their hearts soften." After a break, we'll discuss yet another federal judge's ruling against the Trump administration on the southern border. This new ruling says that the Trump administration is violating its own policy. Maria Teresa Kumar will join our discussion. A federal district court judge in Washington, D.C. last night ordered the Trump government to immediately release or grant hearings to more than 1,000 asylum seekers who have been jailed, some of them for years, without being granted the due process of having their own cases reviewed individually. The Washington Post reports U.S. District Judge James E. Boasberg said U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement ignored its own policy, stating that asylum applicants who establish a credible fear of persecution in their native country must be granted a court hearing within 7 days or be released. He granted a preliminary injunction preventing the government from carrying out blanket detentions of asylum seekers at 5 large U.S. field offices. Joining our discussion now from El Paso, Texas, is Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino and an MSNBC contributor. And Maria Teresa, this ruling tonight goes to this problem that asylum seekers have been finding. They have been treated as criminals, essentially, by the Trump government when they arrive.
What the judge hit the nail on the head with the Trump administration's policy of trying to criminalize asylum seekers and thus breaking the law. About a week ago, when I was down in McAllen, one of the things that we were finding was reports where the Border Patrol were literally on bridges that crossed from Mexico into the United States, telling asylum seekers that America was full, that they had to turn back. That, by international law, is breaking it, and unfortunately, the Trump administration is being able to demonstrate that not only do they not care about asylum seekers, but they are willing to throw the book at individuals that are coming and fleeing some of the most devastating situations. The fact today that the judge ruled against what Trump is doing, it not only demonstrates on a litany of issues when it comes to how Trump is treating immigrants and those seeking asylum from the most vulnerable, but also demonstrates that even how he is treating families right now that are currently being separated is really in the gray area of the law.
And Maria Teresa, as we discussed at the beginning of the show, new Quinnipiac poll shows that 49% of American voters think that the president is racist. That same Quinnipiac poll says that only 39% approve of the president's immigration policy, 58% disapprove of it, and I think those two pieces of the poll are related.
Absolutely. I think what we're demonstrating with the Trump administration is that he wants to single out what type of immigrant should be coming to this country, whether they're seeking asylum or otherwise. If you recall last year, he basically said he only wanted immigrants from Norway, and he has since conducted policies that demonstrate to that point. If we take away the way he's currently treating families seeking asylum and look at what he's doing internally at taking away temporary protective status from individuals from Haiti, from Honduras, from Sudan. He's also taking away visas from entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley that are disproportionately from South Asia. He is also talking about possibly rescinding naturalization from naturalized citizens that are disproportionately people of color. You have a clear sentiment of what he actually believes Americans should be. But that ship has sailed. If you look right now at a generation of kids that are right now in kindergarten, my kids are 4 and 5 years old. They represent the majority minority America, the America that is inclusive, diverse. It is what we have been seeing in the marches from the moment that they started protesting his ascension into the White House, from the Women's March to more recently on Saturday, families coming together saying stop the separation. These were Americans, regardless of political stripes, saying that what the currency that Trump right now is trying to propagate in the United States of what Americans should look like not only will not be tolerated, but it actually is the antithesis of what Americans are. Tomorrow we celebrate the 4th of July. Lawrence, we are celebrating our American values. We're celebrating the fact that we are a nation of immigrants. And I think Donald Trump has a really difficult time swallowing that.
Maria Teresa Kumar, thank you very much for joining us once again here on The Last Word. Really appreciate it. Tonight's Last Word is next. After you have celebrated your independence tomorrow, you can join us here at The Last Word at 10 p.m. as usual for our July 4th special program. We'll be joined by Joy Reid and Professor Michael Eric Dyson, who will discuss his new book, What Truth Sounds Like, an important message for these times. And we'll also be joined by Tom Arnold, who recently spent some time chatting with Trump fixer Michael Cohen, but previously spent a lot of time with his ex-wife, Roseanne Barr. Tom Arnold is going to tell us what he thinks has happened to Roseanne, who used to be a liberal and is now a Trump supporter. We'll also be joined by David Hogg and his sister Lauren Hogg, who survived the mass murder at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. They are student activists now. That is all tomorrow night on The Last Word right here at 10 p.m.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes from MSNBC. You know, every day I come to the office and we make a television show. And every day I think to myself, there's so much more I want to talk about. And so this is our podcast. It's called Why Is This Happening? And the whole idea behind it is to get to the root of the things that we see play out every day. They're driven by big ideas. Each week, I sit down with a person uniquely suited to explain why this is happening.
New episodes of Why Is This Happening? Every Tuesday. Listen for free wherever you get your podcasts.